Thank you very much. Sifo, let me congratulate you and commend you for this initiative that started a little over 9 years ago. You're going to your 10th anniversary of the Global Business Roundtable. And I want to congratulate you and pray that this beautiful annual convention of people grows from strength to strength. I also want to thank Professor Tesha, who is the prime mover of our forum of retired African presidents, and he keeps being our taskmaster. He ordered me to be here, and I am here. And I want to thank Amelia, his able assistant, for all the work that she does to make our forum successful. I'm going to be as brief as I can, and speaking to the theme about sustainable economic growth and bridging income inequalities, or equitable distribution of resources. This goes to the heart of the Sustainable Development Goal 8, SDG 8, which speaks about sustainable economic growth and decent work. And as we know, sustainable economic development takes place within a context of a global environment. I'm a historian, so I normally like to start from a historical perspective. Post-World War II, the world looked forward to an era of peace where global prosperity would reach all corners of the world and make people live a decent life. Unfortunately, post-World War, we entered into the Cold War phase, where the world got divided between the East and the West. The nuclear arms race took place, and after some decades, eventually the fall of the Iron Curtain, symbolized by the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, occurred. And so in this period, everybody looked forward to a multilateral world in which global actions would be guided by consensus in order to ensure prosperity for everybody. This was called the era of globalization, and it held very exciting prospects for economic growth for all mankind in all parts of the world. We went into what we call global targeting with the Millennium Development Goals, where we all as a world came together and set targets and said, look, we want to achieve these targets to bring as many people out of poverty, to take people out of extreme hunger. This was a commendable partnership of people working together as one planet, one world, in order to share prosperity. The Millennium Development Goals managed to bring billions of people out of poverty in the period of its implementation. And of course, its successor became the Sustainable Development Goals, which we're working on now. How do we achieve sustainable economic growth in the current unpredictable world environment? Indeed, everybody is confused about where the world is headed now. The world was more predictable. Things were organized on a multilateral basis. But currently, with the rise of populism, with the rise of America first, and every nation, concentrating on its own development, one asks, how are we going to achieve sustainable economic development? We have conflicts in many regions of the world. We have the rise of extremism and terrorism. We also have climate change as a factor that we have to deal with. Recently, the cyclone that hit Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi have caused extensive devastation. And so in this current world, climate change, populism, terrorism, extremism, and all that, how are we going to expect to achieve sustainable economic development? But in all this, where does Africa stand? Ghana was the first country to gain independence, and there was a lot of excitement that at last one black nation had emerged from colonialism and it was going to become a model of prosperity to the rest of the world, to show the world that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. The excitement gradually gave way to gloom because our first president was dispatched in a coup d'etat, and after that coup d'etats became more the norm than the exception. And so a long period of instability occurred until 1992 when we reverted to constitutional rule. But talking about Africa as a whole, democratic consolidation since the period of the late 90s has created a more stable environment. And as a result of that more stable environment, we're seeing some economic growth taking place on the continent. It is an average of 4% growth in African economies. And in some cases, the 6 fastest growing economies have been on the continent. And so it means that there's a nexus between a stable political environment and sustainable economic growth. And so some of the growth we're beginning to see is as a result of democratic consolidation. There's also a gradual improvement in infrastructure. In ICT, there's been an explosion of ICT across the continent, and indeed, information and communication technologies in Africa are some of the fastest growing. We have mobile banking, we have all kinds of new technologies that are coming, 3G, 4G, and Africa is actually leapfrogging in that area. We're seeing a more educated population than before. More of our young people are going to school and coming out as graduates with degrees in different areas of specialization. We're seeing women's empowerment. More women are going to school. More women are coming out and joining the world of work. But most of all, we're seeing a growing youthful population, or what we call a youth bulge. It's estimated that about 60% of the population of Africa is under 35 years of age. And so these are all positive things towards ensuring the achievement of sustainable economic growth. But there are danger signs, and one is that our economies are not growing fast enough. It is estimated that to be able to create sustainable development, African economies must grow above 8%. And so the sluggish 4% average growth is not sufficient. We need to accelerate that growth in order that we can move more of our people out of poverty. Then aside from that, with a youthful population, we're not creating enough jobs to find decent work for our young people. Many of them are coming out of schools without the right skills to enter the world of work. And so people are going and getting a grammar education, a grammar school education. Others are specializing in areas where there are not sufficient job opportunities. Our economics are growing in different directions, and the school curriculums remain static. And so people are coming out of school and not having the skills to enter the world of work. That's one of the problems that we're facing. There's growing inequality because the fruits of growth are not being distributed fairly. And so even though there's an average 4% growth across the continent, how many people are benefiting from that 4% economic growth? There's a new class of vulnerable people, poor people, falling into the poverty trap. And we need to pay attention to that class of people. We also have the adverse effects of climate change. Africa is most affected by the effects of climate change than anywhere else in the world. We've contributed the least towards global warming, and yet we're suffering the most from the effects of climate change. We also have falling commodity prices. As you know, Africa is a continent that is mainly engaged in primary production and export of natural resources. Worst of all, we have a low level of inter-African trade. Because of our colonial experiences, the pattern and direction of our trade is to our former colonial masters. And so the ports are busy moving goods from Africa to European destinations, from European destinations to Africa, but very little cross-border trade, even amongst neighbors that share the same common border. And so the question we ask is, what must we do to achieve sustainable economic growth and bring down income inequalities? The first thing is to transform our economies. Most of our economies are still based on the colonial model that was left by our colonial masters. And so primary production, principally to export natural resources to the developed countries and import capital goods from there. So we need to transform our economies and diversify our economies. We must increase investment in infrastructure. The World Bank says that there's an infrastructure investment shortfall in Africa of in excess of $2 billion per year. And so we must be, in our countries, investing $2 billion per year to be able to get the kind of infrastructure that would accelerate economic growth. We must allow free movement of people, goods, and services. There are some things that are outside our control, but there are others that we can do. It's not rocket science to open your borders and let people be able to move freely. If you're a South African and you want to travel to, say, Egypt, you need to go to the Egyptian embassy and get a visa. If you're a Ghanaian and you want to come to South Africa, like I came, I had to get a visa to come here. And so our people cannot move freely amongst our countries. And the worst is that goods and services are unable to move freely across our borders. And so this constrains the growth of African economies. There'll be a multiplier effect if people could move freely and goods and services could move freely across our borders. We must accelerate women's empowerment. Women form the majority of our population in most of our countries. And for them not to be able to realize their full potential takes off a certain percentage of GDP growth of all our economies. If women are able to participate more in the economic activity of our countries, it will enhance and spur sustainable economic growth. And so that's one of the things that we need to look at. We must improve social safety nets for the poor and vulnerable who are falling into the poverty trap as a result of the application of more market instruments. There are a new class of people who are falling into the poverty trap, and so we need to create social safety nets, especially in the health sector and education. They must be able to get an education without dropping out of school because their parents cannot pay for it, or they must be able to get health care when they are ill because there's a good social insurance system that allows them to get health care. We need to reduce the informal economy in our countries. In most African countries, the informal economy accounts for almost 60% of the total size of the economy. And so we must bring more of that informal economy into the formal economy. We must increase availability and access to power. The World Bank estimates that only 35% averagely of Africans have access to power. Of course, there are exceptions like South Africa, like Egypt, like Ghana, my own country. We have above 76% access to power, but largely across the continent, there is no access to power. And if there's no access to power, there cannot be economic development. I've seen what power can do, electricity can do when it is extended to a neighborhood. There was a guy who repaired tires in a small village along a highway, and he used to use a pump that used a motor. And so he had to buy fuel and put into it, or petrol and put into it. And so at night he shut down and shut off his machine and went to sleep. When power came to that village, he changed his generating plant into an electric motor and continued to repair tires. He put lights around his vulcanizing business. And then soon a tea seller came and joined him and was selling tea to the drivers who stopped to fix their tires. And then soon somebody opened a filling station, and so the trucks could fill their tanks with diesel. And then soon other people joined, and you should see what has happened to that community just because power arrived in the community. It is an instrument for transformation. We must prioritize investment. Resources are never enough. If you are president, you know that. Your resource envelope is never going to be enough to cover all sectors. And so you need to prioritize and say, look, I'm going to select these sectors they're going to be the priority. I'm going to put the bulk of investment into these sectors and make sure that I make a difference. In my case as president, I prioritize the transport sector, expanding our airports, expanding our harbors, our ports. I prioritize the road sector, improving the road network so that goods could be transported and people could be transported easily across the country. I prioritize the health sector to ensure that we had a good hospital facility in every district of the country. I prioritize the education sector to make sure that we expanded access to basic and secondary education. And I prioritize the energy sector to make sure that we had enough power. And so in the 4 years that I was president, we were able to add almost 2,000 megawatts of power to our energy mix. And that's how come that Ghana has sufficient power and is able to give it to as many people. We need to look at continuous implementation of development plans. One of the major devils of our democratic consolidation is a lack of continuity between governments. We hold elections, one party goes out of power, another one comes in. And all the development projects that were ongoing under the previous government, the next government changes its priorities, and then you see that these projects are abandoned. And so you don't have a smooth implementation of development. And I think that if all these are sorted out, we can see more sustainable growth than we are seeing. Much of this diagnosis we all know, and we've spoken about it over and over and over. The devil is in the implementation and the political will to be able to implement these solutions in order that we can create prosperity for all the people of Africa. The AU has come out with Agenda 63, which we all are working to incorporate into our development plans. But we need the political will to work together as a continent in order that we can ensure sustainable development, economic growth for all our countries. I thank you for this opportunity.